Hi, everybody. Today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the status of women, particularly women of color, with regards to race, media, and digital feminism. In my work at Rutgers, I do a lot of work on Black women's intellectual history, hip-hop feminism, and representations of race and gender in popular culture. So you'll see a few of those kinds of things making cameo appearances in our discussion today. First, one of the things that is sort of most infuriating about the status of women in media is that in the last 20 years, not much has changed in terms of representations of the women who are actually producing the kind of traditional news media that you get both in print and on television. So still 63.4% of bylines and on-camera appearances are with men. We see the most parity, and if you're thinking about a traditional print source, in the Chicago Sun-Times, and then the fewest if you look at the New York Times. At the same time, though, the internet has really become the place where women can achieve any level of parity, and even with online sites, of course, as many of us would expect, at Fox News and the Daily Beast, those are the two sites that have the least representation of women getting bylines, and the Huffington Post actually approaches parity, and about 48% of the bylines that appear at the Huffington Post feature women journalists or female journalists. So we are seeing, on the one hand, that the people who produce the content that shapes the way in which we understand the world and the way in which we engage it are by and large still men, and mostly white men. And that matters in this particular media moment, where we have not only an issue of representation in terms of who's behind the scenes and producing the content, or who's on camera offering content, but we also have a different problem when we talk about representations of actual women within the space of news media. And so I thought that apropos of this moment, we could talk a bit about what happened at the RNC last week when Melania Trump plagiarized a few lines from First Lady Michelle Obama's 2008 convention speech. And one of the things that struck me that morning as I watched the coverage that night and the next morning after Melania Trump's speech was that whether I was watching CNN or I was watching MSNBC, there were several pundits who kept saying, you have to feel bad for Melania. Clearly, a speechwriter dropped the ball. We really, have to feel sympathy for this terrible and humiliating thing that has happened to her. And I thought, this is so interesting because it is representative across the board of who is in front of the camera and the ways that we are trained to both think and talk about women, and particularly women of color. So Melania Trump has been no stranger to controversy. She's a former model. So a few months back, there were leaked nudes of her, and then a conversation about whether she was fit to be First Lady. But I think the thing that we should think about, particularly if we consider what we call an intersectional feminist perspective, one in which we care not just about the politics of gender at the structural level or the representational level, but also the way that issues of race and class and sexuality and ability and so forth interact with the operations of gender and the operations of patriarchy, then it becomes really, really hard to suggest that Michelle Obama would have been equally as sympathetic if she had been found to have plagiarized significant portions of any speech that she got on stage to give. And so there's a way that even the call for sympathy represents this interesting convergence of who offers the news to us, who are the journalists, and these long histories of problematic representations of women of color. So that part of what happens with Melania Trump is that white women representationally are figured as being inherently sympathetic, even when they have clearly screwed up, clearly violated acceptable social norms, namely that we don't plagiarize and that we don't use the work of others without proper citation, still they are cast as being sympathetic. And as a Black feminist and as a scholar, I was like, I don't have any sympathy for this white woman who has clearly lifted portions of this speech. And it became really important to say that in a moment where Michelle Obama has been lambasted on the right. Representative Jim Sensenbrenner once said that she had a large posterior. In other words, he said she had a big butt. There was a huge, controversy about her taking her formal portraits as First Lady in a sleeveless dress. So there is a very different discourse of womanhood that the media has shaped representationally about white women versus Black women, really since the advent of thinking about and talking about women in media in the 1830s in this country. And so there's a way that Melania Trump becomes sympathetic in ways that Black women simply are not. And that has everything to do not just with how the sort of messages that shape how we perceive women, but also who is making media. And it's so interesting too, because one of the things that an intersectional feminist perspective asks us to hold as a complicated tension is that, in fact, white women still don't have any level of parity with white men when we think about news media. That remains true, and yet when we tell stories about women in the media, white women still enjoy the privilege of coming off as infinitely more sympathetic than Black women and other women of color. One of the shining bright spots from the years 2012 to 2016 was Melissa Harris Perry's show on MSNBC, also titled The Melissa Harris Perry Show. And so in February of this year, Melissa did her final show and left in a controversy with MSNBC as they pivoted towards a committed focus on the elections and only doing election coverage. But her exit from MSNBC was also part and parcel of a series of high-profile exits from the network by hosts of color, both women and men, Black and Latino, whose shows had been unceremoniously cut. Everybody from Jose Diaz-Balart to Alex Wagner to Joy Reid had shows cut within the span of a few months of each other. And so Melissa Harris Perry's show was a sort of shining spotlight in the midst of a sea of whiteness. And if you look at representations of white folks versus people of color, even just on the traditional Sunday morning politics shows, you'll see that the MHP show was the only show where people of color were the pundits and the media commentators at a greater number than white participants. And not only, what's interesting is they outnumbered white participants, but there was also still something approaching a level of parity. And when you look at every other show, there is simply no comparison. The levels of white representation and white media commentary are absolutely astronomical in terms of the amount of disparity between which people of color, how many people of color are getting invited to these shows. So we are at the nexus of two really competing types of challenges, right? One is how do we diversify who our media makers are, who our journalists are, who are the folks who frame stories. And any of you who were a fan of the Melissa Harris Perry Show know that this show committed itself to really smart kinds of commentary that featured scholars and everyday people and journalists and activists. Since Melissa left the show, which I had the pleasure to participate in many times during its tenure, we have not had we have not had a show comparable to that, and the media landscape does not look like we're going to have anything comparable to it again for a very long while. So then, what does this mean when we think about the actual demographics of who's making news, particularly with regard to women of color? So one of the most appalling statistics, and I looked, if you're interested in this topic in terms of the stats, the Women's Media Center is a progressive news outlet that puts out a report each year. They did them from 2012, 2013, 2014, where they look at the status of women in media. And I had the opportunity to do some media training with the Women's Media Center back in 2012. And so they are really committed to increasing the number of women who are media makers and news makers. And one of the things that their 2014 report found was that when you look at all demographics of women of color, whether you're talking about Asian American, Latinx, Black or African American, or indigenous women, the representation of women in newsrooms has decreased since the mid and early 2000s. And this is so interesting, right, because it happens in a moment where there is this attempt to shift to this idea that we're post-feminist, that there are not still these structural struggles around the treatment of women. And as a feminist scholar, one of the things that becomes very interesting to me is I continue to have students in my classes who say that, that they don't always see the need for feminist struggle anymore, that other than, for instance, protecting like reproductive rights and advancing a reproductive justice framework, they say women can vote. We see women in positions of leadership. Just this week, a woman has become the major party nominee for president. And so it would lead us possibly to this idea that all of a sudden women have really achieved parity, and that in terms of feminist movement building, our struggle can move on to other equally important topics like, securing a world that is safe for queer and trans folks, particularly queer and trans folks of color. And certainly those are my feminist commitments as well. But I think when you look at one of the, bastions of like, one of the sort of key societal institutions in a civil society, namely the press, right, and the media, we're still seeing numbers that actually have not fit this sort of 21st century narrative of progress that we want to tell. So then when you look, so that's just a snapshot of what's happening to women in media. Then when you look at what's happening to women in film and television, the story becomes even more disturbing. So I'm a huge fan of the work of Ava DuVernay, and one of the reasons I'm a fan is because in my lifetime, really in my adulthood, she is the primary Black woman film director and director of television shows, other than Shonda Rhimes, who is making like mainstream films and getting some traction, and also doing it in a way that is not that challenges stereotypical representations of Black women and people of color. And so in 2015, she became the first Black woman director ever to have a film nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and that was her movie Selma. And if you'll note, there was almost 25 years between 1991, when Julie Dash became the first Black woman director to have a mainstream film debut in the cinema, and when Ava DuVernay became the first Black woman director to actually have a film achieve the status of being nominated for Best Picture. So there's a huge lag time when we think about the kind of progress that we say that women have been making. Not only are white women not making astronomical leaps in terms of their media progress, but then when we look across other demographics of women, the progress that they make goes so slow that many of you might not have been born when the first milestone happened, right? So even in your lifetime, these two things have not necessarily coexisted, and that is something that we should be deeply concerned about. When we look, for instance, at speaking roles in films, right, only 6%, this is again from the Women's Media Center report, only 6% of the top films in the last, I think this was in 2013, cast male and female sexes in equal numbers. And when you look across the board at films in 2012 and 2013, women had speaking roles in those films at only about a 30% rate, which is so interesting because, you know, we typically wouldn't think that because we say, well, we have chick flicks and we have, you know, sort of family dramas. But it turns out that when you look every year at the top 100 films, there's this startling issue where women actually aren't talking in those films very much. If you look at the year 2012, only 10% of speaking roles went to Black actors, 5% to Asian actors, and 4.2% to Latino actors. And then when you look across the board at the amount of women that have speaking parts, you know, it's an interesting kind of narrative that emerges because 34.8% of the speaking roles given to women were to Asian women, 34% were to Black women, 33.9% were to Hispanic women, and 28% were to white women. And this is interesting, right, for a couple of reasons. One, because it seems to be an inverse demographic than we would typically consider, so it looks like Asian women are speaking more. But what this study doesn't account for is the substance of what's being said, and so whether these are really complex representations of Asian American womanhood that we're seeing, or complex representations of Black womanhood or Hispanic womanhood. And then when we look more specifically at the statistics in terms of how these women are represented in these films, then we find that in many cases they are either provocatively attired or partially nude, and Latina women then emerge as those who are most often placed in provocative or partially nude attire, followed by Black women, white women, and Asian women. So even when we're looking on screen, we're not seeing a huge number of women get speaking roles in general. When they are in speaking roles, those speaking roles often aren't substantial, and then very often we are encountering these women either in a partially nude state or in a sexually provocative state. And look, I'm a pro-sex feminist, so I don't have a problem with us having very sexy representations of women. The problem becomes, one, when women are objectified in these representations, and two, when this is the only mode of engagement that we see. So we don't see a comparable range of complex engagements of these women's lives and multi-layered portrayals of who they are and the complex ways that, that they exist as human beings in the world. So one of the ways that we should be skeptical even of the narrative that says that, you know, that women are speaking, you know, so like I was very skeptical of this idea that Asian American women were speaking a lot in films. So one of the ways to think about whether the kinds of speaking roles women of color are getting are substantial is to think about the Bechdel test. So Alison Bechdel created, she's a graphic novelist, but she created the Bechdel test in the 1980s because she noticed that when you watched movies, most of the women on screen aren't actually talking to each other, and when they are talking to each other, typically they're talking to each other about men. So the Bechdel test says that for any movie to pass this test, it has to have at least 2 women in it. They have to talk to each other, and they have to talk about something other than a man. So the next time you're watching a film, this is a little test you can do. When women are on screen, are they talking to each other? And then when they're talking to each other, are they talking to each other about something other than the men in their lives or talking about relationships with the men or what have you? In 2015, 45% of the top 100 movies last year failed the Bechdel test. So it turns out that a startlingly large amount of movies that get made cannot quite conceive of women actually talking, 1, to each other, 2, about something other than men, 3. And one of the things that made me so aware of this was when Selma debuted, we did a talk back with Ava DuVernay, and one of the things she said was that she taped a specific scene in that movie where 2 of the characters are talking with each other. It's Amelia Boyne Robinson and Coretta Scott King. Their characters are talking, and they're just talking about their role in the movement, in the civil rights movement as women. And she said, the reason I shot this scene this way is because I wanted to pass the Bechdel test. But it is evidence of the manner in which you have to be so intentional to shoot scenes that are not male-centered, right? And so even the way that patriarchy shows up in our representational lives is not just that women aren't entrusted to write the news, to deliver the news, but also that even in the fictive worlds of movies that we're often watching, so much of the kind of labor and conversation that women have still is so deeply male-centered. So then, is there any hope? You'll note that I primarily have focused in terms of traditional media sources, right? Films, television, morning and Sunday news shows, and then increasingly some internet outlets. But I think that if we're going to think about the sort of possibilities of getting beyond this all-consuming focus on whiteness and maleness, which is also putatively straight white maleness and cisgender white maleness, then we're going to have to look beyond traditional media formats. And we should be heartened by the fact that there have been an explosion of representations of women in non-traditional forms of media, like blogs and vlogs, podcasts, and web shows. So I'll talk a little bit about the media making that I have participated in. In 2010, I got together with a group of women of color, Black, South Asian, and Latina, queer and straight, and we created what we call the Crunk Feminist Collective. Many of us went to graduate school together, and we were in graduate school in Atlanta at the height of the Crunk era. So you're thinking Lil Jon, you're thinking Bone Crusher, all kinds of Southern hip hop, the kind of stuff that we would go to the club and dance to. And so we had a party one night, and we were like, we're crunk, and we're also feminist. And, you know, there was this tension, right? Because you would go to the club, and, you know, Southern hip hop, booty shake music is very, it is not at all feminist. It is very often deeply misogynist, but it also gives, if you're anything like me, that kind of ratchet music really gives you great joy. And so, you know, it was the place where we work out a lot of our anxiety about being in institutions that were racially hostile and sexist and homophobic. So we would go to the club. But we also had a really clear feminist politic and commitment to challenging heteropatriarchy. And so we thought we would put those things together. So in 2010, we started a blog where women of color to talk to each other, but outside of the space of the academy. Most of us are academics or organizers by trade, but we wanted to be able to have conversations like we would have if you're at somebody's house and you're sitting on the sofa or you're having a couple of drinks, and we wanted to challenge like the sort of elitism of having to have access to institutional spaces in order to be able to have particular kinds of conversations. And so we've gone through many shifts and changes in the 6 years of the Crunk Feminist Collective, but we're a committed group of 8 writers today. Many of us, you know, some of us have families, some of us, you know, have really taken Crunk activism, and, you know, to kind of transform the institutions in which we work, but we have a particular commitment to what we call a hip-hop generation feminist perspective, and it's our generationally specific articulation of feminist consciousness, epistemology, which is a fancy word for knowledge systems and frameworks that shape how we come to know the things that we know, and politics rooted in multiple generations of Black feminist work. And even though we are a women of color space, the women of color in our collective very much see their feminist activism as rooted in the thinking and theory production of Black feminist scholars and activists. We take a cue from Joan Morgan, who coined the term hip-hop feminism in 1999, where she called for a feminism brave enough to fuck with the grays. And we also see our work in line with the notion of crunkness as being percussive and as really trying to engage a productive tension generated by placing competing concerns in conversation, like hip hop and feminism, or for instance, like Black nationalism and feminism, things that typically don't go together. We see them as being a space of generativity. And so in many ways, we benefited from the fact that the blogosphere had been cultivated in the early 2000s by young feminists of color and young feminist activists, period, who were really some of the first innovators online to see it as a place that you could tell the kinds of stories that you otherwise wouldn't hear in the news media. And so we came into a fairly well-established feminist blogosphere in the 2010s, but we're able to add unique perspectives just of our own, but also what we brought was the narrative, the sort of notion of collectivity, and that the way that you could kind of change the landscape was by sharing the labor. So one of the great things that I love about the Crunk Feminist Collective, we don't all think the same, we don't vet each other's pieces, but we do have a community where we can call each other or text each other and work out our thinking around particular issues, and then we've created a community online where that can still happen. And so it became a place for us to connect with people who wanted to have the kind of conversations we wanted to have. But the other thing that happened as we were doing it was that all of a sudden people began to pay attention that there were young feminists of color online who had really, who were deeply opinionated about everything from politics to popular culture. And so the CFP has shifted some in the last couple of years because we all have careers and families, which is the thing that happens when you get over 30, which most of us weren't when we first started. And so in the middle years of the collective, we would frequently get calls from NPR, from various news outlets who had us in the regular rotation and would read the things we were doing at the blog and say, this is not a perspective we've heard before, but we read you guys because we want to know what young women of color are saying about these issues. And so that shift where all of a sudden you have young women of color media makers coming from the bottom up without lots of institutional access, using free tools online, really has shifted the landscape of the kind of stories that get told. And so because I am a Crunk feminist and because I am me, I could not do this presentation, this webinar, without talking a little bit about Beyonce. And in her words, I ain't sorry for doing it, but the thing that I think is really important to say about Beyonce with regard to race, media, and digital feminism is that you actually cannot understand the phenomena of a Beyonce outside of the context of a really rich digital media environment. So I have been a Beyonce fan since 1997 when Destiny's Child dropped their first album, and I was in high school. So I know some of you young bucks came along around album 2 or 3, but I have been there since the beginning. And let me tell you that Beyonce and Destiny's Child were not on any of the things that they are on today. And what we could not have anticipated nearly 20 years ago when their first singles dropped was that she would be not only, we might have anticipated that she would have been a pop icon and superstar, although I don't think that was the conversation about her even at that time, but we certainly wouldn't anticipate that the world's biggest pop star would be so committed to a particular naming of feminist political activism. And that has everything to do with the way that feminist bloggers and feminists who use social media sites like Tumblr and Twitter have trickled into the landscape and deeply influenced and shifted the conversation. And the thing that made me know that was that after Beyonce's 2013 album, self-titled Beyonce, she did a series of self-titled videos on YouTube, and when she talked about the choice to name feminism in her work, the thing she said was, I was searching for videos about feminism on YouTube. And so that let me know that whereas two prior generations ago, if you wanted to know what feminism meant, you would have gone like I did to a set of hardcover encyclopedias and pulled out the F's, looked at under F, and looked that up. 10 years after that, you would have put in a CD-ROM with an encyclopedia on it and done something similar just via computer. But 20 years later, what you do when you want to know something is you either do a Google search, or more specifically, you get not even just on Google, but on YouTube. And so that let me know that this was a world in which young women are finding out about the things that matter to them, the concerns that matter to them in the space of YouTube. And so we haven't just seen this shift with Beyonce, we have also seen this explosion of young femme activists of color who are making real interventions in terms of thinking about the intersections of race and gender in media. But before I talk about that, I see one question asking me if I can expand on what I meant by fucks with the grays. And so if you guys have questions, then I want to try to engage them as much as I can, so please send them. So when I use the term fucks with the grays, it's from Joan Morgan's 1999 book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, and she's talking about a generational feminism that parts from the kind of second wave Black feminism of women like Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins, and she's asking us to sit in the things that are complicated about our feminism, right? There's a way that we have all of these narratives about what it means to be feminist, what it means to be anti-patriarchy, what it means to be woke, but we don't always manage to pull that off easily. So, you know, it's an acknowledgement that some of the TV and music that we consume is in fact not feminist. I love hip hop and it is ratchet and it is misogynist. It's not feminist, but it is part of my cultural heritage. It's part of even a resistance practice, because sometimes when I go to my job at Rutgers, where I'm going to be dealing with white colleagues and students who are going to say racist and sexist things, then I pull up to the job listening to ratchet hip hop, which gets me hyped, which is very irreverent, which is pretty profane and vulgar. It allows me to blow off some steam, to release a little bit of anger, and then I go on into work where I, give students the tools and work together with students to get the tools to critique the world in which we live. And so fucking with the grays is about dealing with those gray areas that are not always black and white. And so in the book, Joan Morgan talks about putting on her best outfit, that's a like tight mini skirt and high heels. And she says, look, like when I put that on, I love looking at myself in the mirror, but do I really not want any attention? Do I really not want anybody to check for me? Do I really not want to be objectified just a little bit? And it like causes young feminists to clutch their pearls, because you're like, objectification is terrible. Down with the patriarchy, right? Yes. And y'all know that when you put on, when you looking fly, you want somebody to be checking for you, right? Like if sexuality is your thing, if you are not an asexual person, then what you are looking for is you want there to be a little bit of appreciation for the efforts you have made. And so it's about having a feminism that represents our complexity. So in the space of this, right? I mean, that is one of the reasons why we can sort of understand the Beyonce, because lots of feminists have critiques of her. She self-objectifies, she promotes capitalism, all of that kind of stuff, right? Which in a different context, or maybe in the question and answer, we can say more about. But the other side of that is that she is not a perfect feminist, but none of us are, but there's something about feminist politics that seems to appeal to her. And so she has chosen to embrace a feminist politic in her work, despite sometimes having just song lyrics that are straight up patriarchal in nature. And so figuring out how to exist in that tension is a bit of what it means to fuck with the grays. So in this digital media landscape where we're seeing more and more young women, and particularly young women of color, embracing the term feminism, which was not true even 10 to 12 years ago when I started to embrace that term. But we're seeing folks like Amon Listenberg and Zendaya and Gina Rodriguez embrace the term and use their media platforms to do activism for women of color in particular, and for their communities. And so they are a product of this this shifting media landscape that we're not yet seeing change in terms of traditional newsrooms, but that we are seeing change in terms of the kinds of conversations that these women have online. So when you look at Amanla or you look at Zendaya, the way that they make interventions is typically to go on Instagram and write mini essays about everything from colorism to beauty politics, to, as Gina Rodriguez has done, to talk quite a bit about policing around Latino identity and the ways that it gets represented, and also then to use their platforms to advance a very specific politic around being more inclusive of women of color in terms of who's getting acting roles and who's making films and doing directing. So all of them have been really vocal about the need to have a more expansive notion of who is represented in the stories that get told and who is making those stories. And I use the term Femme here, and I think it's important to say, because Amon Listenberg has said more recently that they don't necessarily use the pronoun she, that they don't necessarily identify entirely with the notion, the gendered identity of womanhood. And so Amanla is at this point in their life feminine presenting. So I wanted to offer several different representations of what femme activists of color look like and the kinds of things that matter to them. And we can certainly say more about that if you have questions in a moment. So what we have now, largely pioneered by young women of color online, is a very diverse digital media ecosystem that, this is Issa Rae, who in 2012 made a splash with her YouTube series, Awkward Black Girl, and will now have a show on HBO in the fall based on Awkward Black Girl, the blog site for Harriet, Blavity, the podcast Unscrewed that Jacqueline Friedman does, Feministing, which has been in the game forever, Another Round, The Read, Janet Mock's web show So Popular on MSNBC, and Janet Mock is a trans Black woman activist. Call Your Girlfriend, Politically Reactive, Very Smart Brothers, Awesomely Lovey, and on and on. You can shout out in the comments section blogs or podcasts or web shows that you think should be part of this roll call as well. I highlighted some of my favorites because what you see when you look at this diverse media ecosystem is that these are all productions that these women and some men engage in primarily of their own accord, because it's, they're minimalist in terms of production, because you can really use an iPhone camera or just a small handheld to do YouTube videos. If you have access to to audio recording material and a decent laptop, you can put out a podcast and have it reach thousands of people every week. And so these are really do-it-yourself forms of media production, but these are also top influencers who, by virtue of their work together, have changed can change the conversation on the nightly news when they all get behind a particular story. One evidence of this is Black Twitter. It has emerged as a social phenomenon that greatly shifts narratives of connectivity, and it has galvanized a social movement, which I'll say more about in a moment. So one of my friends just says Black Twitter is, has no behavior, and it is what happens if you just give Black people access to the ability to drag people and play the dozens with each other in digital time and space at any given moment. And so it has really capitalized on particular cultural forms of Black humor, but also the ways that we subvert and resist clearly, overtly racist acts. So when Melania Trump plagiarized Michelle Obama last week, Black Twitter responded with hashtag Melania Trump's famous quotes, and proceeded really to just play with the idea that she was calling things original that were really not her own. And so it has emerged as a particular kind of phenomena. But that level of social media connectivity has galvanized the social movement. So we're now at the height of the Oh, so yeah, so there were some shout outs. Bitch Media, which I love, The Establishment also, so thank you for those. So Black Twitter has become the, you know, third arm, right, of the movement for Black Lives, or the Black Lives Matter movement, which is, you know, composed of, um, with organizers and activists on the ground, pushes, towards the top for different kinds of change, and then also work on social media. So it has become a significant organizing and mobilizing tool in the movement. In 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed, the Million Hoodies movement put out a call in one day for folks to show up in Union Square to march on behalf of Trayvon, and thousands of people showed up to march in Union Square. I was one of those folks. And then after his killer was acquitted in 2013, Patrisse Cullors-Khan, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza came together and started using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And so much of, Black Twitter and tools like Periscope have galvanized and shifted the kind of stories that get told, because very often when some kind of injustice happens, like when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in August 2014, the story broke on Twitter with someone sharing pictures of his body still laying on the ground before it ever trickled up to news media. So you have a media movement from below that is insisting that mainstream media begin to cover more diverse stories. And you also have a range of editors at mainstream publications who often got those jobs because they've had a significant Twitter presence. Even when you think about people like Melissa Harris Perry, who had a significant Twitter presence before she really broke into big-time news media, Jamila Lemieux, who is a senior editor at Ebony magazine, Darnell Moore, Jamil Smith, many of these folks, Zerlina Maxwell, who worked for the Hillary campaign but was a contributor at Fox News before doing that. Many of these folks were recognized first by media organizations because of their strong Twitter presence. And finally, Black Twitter and Twitter more generally has become a primary place for public accountability in the face of racial faux pas among white people. And so then other groups of folks who use Twitter, and there are subsets of Twitter, right? There's feminist Twitter. They don't all exist in the aggregate in the way that we have come to think about Black Twitter, but communities exist online, and when folks offend those communities and injure those communities, social media has become a way to hold them accountable and often to even to bring about some consequences. So I wanted you to see, just in the mode of citation, Patrisse Cullors-Khan, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also simply to say, this is what gives me hope. So I don't know that mainstream media will shift. I think that it's a shift we should continue to fight for, but I think that one of the things that Web 2.0 technologies have done for us is allowed people of color, queer folks, folks of different abilities to really get online and use technologies to tell the stories that matter. And I think we should continue to do that with a kind of fervent commitment. And as we do so, when it matters, we are able to force the mainstream media to tell the stories that matter to us. And that's a revolution that is unique to the 21st century. It's not something that we've ever seen before, and I think it's something that all of us who do this kind of media making work should be very proud of. That's it. Questions? So I have a question. How do I see these kinds of movements evolving in the future? If you mean social movements, I think that mostly what I can speak to would be the movement for Black Lives and then also kind of feminist movement building. I think that the movement for Black Lives isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Social movements take many, many years to be in the making, and then they often last for a really long time, but they have ebbs and flows. So I think we're in the first burst of this new movement for Black Lives. It's really been going pretty hardcore since 2014. I think that to the extent that we continue to have media tools available to us, even, for instance, the killing of Philando Castile in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, the fact that in that moment, it wasn't just that she took video and then posted it later, but rather that she was able to live stream his murder, which is gut-wrenching in many ways, suggests that much like the civil rights movement, where televisions were a new technology, particularly having personal televisions in one's home, so King and other civil rights strategists capitalized on the fact that they could dramatize nonviolence by streaming the brutal sort of assault of nonviolent Black people into the homes of white America via television every night. And that is the way that they shifted social consciousness, was by marrying organizing tools and techniques with emerging technologies. And I think the movement for Black Lives has been at the fore of doing that in ways, even, for instance, that the Occupy movement, which was violently suppressed by the government, still was not able to fully capitalize on. But there's something about the visuality of the movement for Black Lives and the way that having video evidence, even though it does not yet seem to be shifting like prosecutions and convictions, it is shifting social consciousness so that folks look at these videos and they say, y'all are lying to us, and we have proof that these encounters aren't going the way you suggest. And and news media, the whole purpose of it is to give us a slice of what is actually going on in the world. And so now you have power in the hands of the people to say, here's how we actually experience the world, and to make those stories a media priority for people that would otherwise avoid them or remain oblivious. And so I don't think the movement is going anywhere. I think that as technology, our ability to continue to tell these stories in ever more graphic detail, as that increases and it shows no signs of abatement, I think that the movement will continue to capitalize on that in the best possible ways. And I think that the establishment will continue to ignore it, but eventually, you just see the consciousness of young people shifting because this is where they're consuming media. And so at some point, the powers that be are not going to be able to fully ignore in the ways that they have thus far been able to. So then I have a question from the McSilver folks around what are some of the things social workers can do to promote gender equality, especially gender equity for women of color? This is a really important question. At Rutgers every year, I actually do a module for our Doctorate of Social Work program, where the thing that I spend time doing with them is saying to them, be firmly committed to an intersectional approach to doing social work. Too often the default approaches that we use when we try to understand the conditions that shape people's lives are rooted in models of whiteness. And so, for instance, in March, I gave a talk for the Administration of Children's Services in New York because they handle foster care and kids that are in juvenile justice. And they didn't have gender-responsive protocols for girls. Like, they just simply didn't exist. And so in 2016, a group of folks have come together to create gender-responsive protocols for system-involved youth, right? And so if New York City, which is one of the most progressive cities in the country and on the planet, does not have a robust gender-responsive set of protocols when they're dealing with youth who are involved in the system, then I shudder to think what kinds of protocols are available to young women who are in precarious positions in other parts of the country. So one, we have got to be really clear about the need for gender responsiveness, but two, we've got to be really clear about the fact that everyone comes to us at several intersections, right? And that there, that we can't just, universalize about the experience of all Black folks or all poor folks or all girls or all queer youth, right? Or we cannot equate the challenges of cis womanhood with the challenges of trans womanhood. And so we got to be sensitive to all of these moving pieces, and sometimes that's hard because the systems in which we work don't give us the resources to take a multi-pronged approach to helping folks. But part of the reason that I wanted to make sure to try to be intersectional and think about both media from above and below and who's making it and then what kind of messages we get is because we always have to be mindful of those things as well, right? We have to be mindful that in any encounter, we are, when students encounter us or system-involved folks encounter people in power, we may share some things in common with them, but we also come with a level of institutional power that can change the dynamic of their lives. And so the thing that I said when I talked at the ACS was, we can't be taken aback when people distrust because they are encountering power when they encounter us in all kinds of ways. And I'm not a social worker, but, being a teacher and an educator means that I'm encountering folks at several intersections, and students who are always like, help me with my life, I need help with my life. And so figuring out who I am in relationship to them, what kind of power I have and how it can be useful, and then figuring out how to make their intersections visible to them in ways that are productive, and figuring out how to make intersections visible to systems in ways that are productive. It's just some of the work we can do as we commit to trying to make the world more just for youth of color. Other questions?
All right, well, it seems that we don't have any more questions, and we only have 3 minutes left. So I just wanted to say once again, Dr. Cooper, thank you so much for joining us for this amazing webinar. I learned a lot. It was really just great listening. And I also wanted to thank everyone for joining. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Great. Can you just do me a favor and move to the last slide, number 20?
Okay, one sec. Yes.
The one after that.
Okay, sorry.
Great. So I just want to remind everyone that we do have another webinar coming up on August 16th, and it is on understanding her story, an anti-oppressive framework for helping professionals working with women. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to any questions you have. You can send them to us via email, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar.